Ever since the invention of photography in 1839, women have been involved in the medium. But I imagine it will come as no surprise to anyone here that the efforts and contributions of those early women photographers have long gone unrecognized. Even the most massive history of the daguerreotype, that first type of photographic image, which was in vogue for only about 15 years in the middle of the 19th century, that history shows no images made by women. So in the last couple of decades, patient detectives of art and photographic historians have come up with a few examples of daguerreotypes produced by women. We know from records there were more than 100 female daguerreotypists registered in the United States, but we only have a handful of images that we can attribute to them. Now, in 1851, a new kind of photographic process was invented called the collodion, or wet plate process. And it was perfected by the 1860s and really replaced the daguerreotype, which gives you only a single image. The collodion plate process was very messy. It involved painting your goo onto your glass negative, and then you had to do the whole process, the preparing the plate, making the image, and developing it within 15 minutes before it dried. So it had its disadvantages, but gave a much clearer product. And that surpassed the daguerreotype. And collodion process photography led to the invention of various other types, including tintypes, which were printed not onto that glass negative, but directly onto metal, although reversed. And so this is a photograph on a glass negative of the tintype booth of Frances Benjamin Johnston at a county fair in 1903. And she wasn't much of a seller. You could have a tintype made on a button or cufflinks. But again, we don't know who produced many of those tintypes. Very few of them are signed. However, Johnston, whom we will see further on in this talk, is one of these photographic pioneers around the turn of the 20th century who really carved a place for women in the genre. But the first important female photographer was British, and this was Julia Margaret Cameron, famous mainly for her portraits and for giving those portraits an evanescent, lifelike quality, unlike daguerreotypes, which were so formal and static. Here, she photographs the son of her idol, the great Victorian poet, Albert Tennyson, and she manages to convey a sense of personality and psychology in a medium that was initially perceived as almost scientific in its objectivity. She also made this sort of image, a reinterpretation of the Holy Family, where we see a mother, an older man, an infant, and an older child, arranged in what initially seems a haphazard way, but is very carefully composed to give this circular feeling of something spiritually important and mysterious going on here. So this borrows from the conventions of Western painting, from the Holy Family with Saint Joseph and Saint John the Baptist, but it's not just a reworking of those conventions. It's not a photograph of a Renaissance painting, which is something that was beginning to be more common, but it is an original work of Victorian era art. And this kind of photography that is attempting to be art and that often uses soft focus to achieve a more artsy effect is known as pictorialism. The most famous American protagonist of pictorialism was Alfred Stieglitz, better known as Mr. Georgia O'Keeffe. But before he met O'Keeffe, he was a photographer, the publisher of an important photographic journal called Camera Work. And in 1902, he formed an association that he called the Photo Secession, dedicated to cementing the concept of photography as art. This would last about 15 years. There were 105 registered photo secessionists, and many of them were women. In fact, of the only 6 West Coast photographers who were members of the photo secession, 4 were women. We will see all of their work today, and this photograph is by a founding member of the secession, Gertrude Käsebier. So one way to encourage photography to be seen as an art form was to emulate the look and feel of famous paintings, which the photographers Frances and Mary Allen do in their A Holbein Woman. The Allen sisters, born in the 1850s, both began to go deaf from a congenital inherited condition in the 1880s. They had been teachers, and deafness put an end to their careers as educators, but they were single women and needed a respectable way to support themselves. So they opened a photography studio, not to have people come and have their portraits made. That was seen as not quite respectable to have strangers come into your home. No, the Allen sisters made self-consciously artistic images like a Holbein woman. So this woman didn't, come to them and say, please make my portrait. They hired her as a sitter so that she could create an image something like this. And so that people could hang on their walls, not a reproduction of a European painting, but an original work by American photographers. They made images of children. They did this Pilgrim's Progress in 1911, a sort of 18th century colonial era image based on the popularity of that book in early America. Photography is deliberately imitating the conventions of painting in these works. Indeed, the Oregon photo secessionist Myra Albert Wiggins claims to have invented the photographic category of Dutch genre. So she gives her subjects wooden shoes, rather oversized ones, I think, and evokes Vermeer and Metsu and Ter Borch and the great genre painters of the Dutch Republic. And you can see the artifice. If you look carefully, the wall is covered with tacked-on burlap to give it a more rustic quality, and it was the wall of Wiggins' barn in Salem. She would also pose her daughter in some smaller wooden shoes, fortunately, at this table she herself made. Hunger is the Best Cook is the title of this work. And while Wiggins never considered herself a professional photographer, because the portrait studio carried that taint of tawdriness, but she would submit works like this to competitions. And the prize money that she won was a very important source of income for her family. Another photographer deliberately evoking an art historical style is Emma Coleman. So by the 1890s, the dry plate process has superseded that messy wet plate process of the 1860s, which meant that photographers could work with portable glass plates they could easily bring outside. They didn't have to bring a dark room with them into the field and, oops, what have I done? Okay, and immediately develop them. So that allowed for more landscape photography, and here Emma Coleman's Woman Gathering Twigs looks as though she could have stepped out of a Barbizon school painting. So she is emulating modern art, the kind of paintings of the school of painters working in the forest of Fontainebleau that preceded the Impressionist generation. Emma Coleman was encouraged to take up photography by a friend who was a landscape painter. And so this is that impulse to create an image of the landscape, to create modern art, but using the tool of photography. Eva Watson-Schutze was another founding member of the photo secession, and like many photo secessionists, she specialized in these soft focus images that evoke impressionist painting and that use of light and a blurrier brush stroke. But she understood that she was walking a fine line between emulating painting and really making works that are uniquely photographic. So her colleague and friend Alice Boughton wrote to her, quote, "The highest supposed praise which is ever applied to a print is that it does not look like a photograph. Why not avowedly use the camera? Why not be ashamed, or why be ashamed that it is not something else?" So these are women working with cameras and wanting to make art. Because if you went to the University of Washington in 1901 and wanted to study photography, what department would your degree come from? Not the art department. You would get a degree in chemistry. The chemistry of photography was so important to the medium in these years, and these artists wanted the artistic side to be paramount. So Zaida Ben Yusuf opened a photographic studio in New York City. She was born in England. Her father was Syrian. She had this sort of exotic persona. If you went to have your photograph made at her studio, it was sort of like consulting a palm reader. But she made these beautiful exotic images like the odor of pomegranates, as well as a number of images for stage actresses at the time, some of which were used in posters and other publicity. Another influential pictorialist photographer was Anne Brigman, the lone California member of the photo secession. So this is her wondrous globe of 1906, and Brigman was a free spirit. As a teenager, she married a sea captain so that she could see the world. And then as a middle-aged woman, she divorced that sea captain. In fact, marital difficulties are endemic among early women photographers. But Brigman saw photography as a spiritual pursuit. So while the wondrous globe dates from about 1906, she was still doing dreamy pictorialist type work well into the 1920s. She scandalized her contemporaries by posing naked in her own photographs, like the soul of the blasted pine. But she has this idea of the spirituality of nature. She is almost a wood nymph in this image, and Cleft of the Rock is a similar study where she's out in the Sierras. She was living and working in Oakland, but going to the Sierras to make these out-of-door images, capturing a world of details, but making them seem almost mythological in scope. Gertrude Käsebier is probably the best known female photo secessionist. And she, too, had an interesting and varied life in that she was born in Iowa, raised in Colorado, where her father was an entrepreneur during the gold rush. So she lived for many years on the edges of the frontier. And then as a late teenager, her family moved to Brooklyn. So she got all sides of American culture. And this is one of her best known images, Blessed Art Thou Among Women. It incorporates ideas derived from pre-Raphaelite painting in England. In fact, this may be a pre-Raphaelite painting or tapestry in the background, framing this scene of mother and daughter. The mother in profile, and the daughter in a frontal view. And so she's playing, like Julia Margaret Cameron, with traditional Christian ideas of the mother and child, but layering them with life in a Victorian-era home. And this woman knows that part of mothering is knowing when to let your child become independent. So she is nurturing with the arm around her, but also urging the girl to step forward on her own. So Käsebier would make images like the manger that also draws on Renaissance paintings of the nativity scene. She called this a study in white on white. So she's very interested in light, in what the camera can do, in how to imbue spirituality into this photomechanical process. And she made a lot of tender photographs of children. In this case, her granddaughter. This is her oldest child, Gertrude Käsebier O'Malley, reading to her child. And a lot of the work is fairly empty. And that's common in pictorialist photography, a lot of what we would call negative space that allows us to focus even more on the image of the story being read. And the kinds of themes that Käsebier and other photo-secessionist women used are very, very similar to the kind of themes that Mary Cassatt was painting in her later works, the mother and child ad infinitum, these tender images of maternity and of children. Käsebier calls this one Happy Days, and we see this adorable little boy who seems to be giving flowers to the girl on the right. She is using the camera frame quite dramatically, cropping the head of the figure with the kitten in her arms to focus in on that couple. And she also places a heterosexual child couple in this image she calls Yoked and Muzzled Marriage. So the boy and girl holding hands encounter this vision of their potential future should they go ahead into holy matrimony. This has been called a bitter image, and Käsebier and her husband lived apart for most of their marriage, but I think it's a very funny image. It's an image with a great deal of humor. Now, a very different photograph with oxen is Margaret Morley's Clearing the Land with Oxen. We know a lot about Morley. She was also born in Iowa and moved to New York, where she did high school and college, and then graduate work in biology in Chicago. And between 1890 and 1915, Morley produced a long series of educational children's books on biology, animals, plants, and scandalously, several books for young people talking about sex and childbirth. And apparently, the whole time she has that career, when she's also a teacher during the school year, she was making photographs in North Carolina every summer. So the North Carolina Historical Society houses hundreds of her negatives, but no obituary of her mentioned that she was a photographer at all. So how she fit it into her busy schedule of writing and teaching, where she learned, we don't know, but she chronicled rural life in North Carolina exhaustively for more than a quarter of a decade, or of a century. Another photographer of rural life was Chansonetta Emmons in rural Maine. She had moved to Boston as a young woman and married and had a child, but was widowed at the age of 40 with a 7-year-old daughter. Now, she was quite fortunate because her brothers, the Stanley brothers, were wealthy. They had invented a photographic process they called the Stanley plate, an improvement on the original glass plate technology introduced in the 1870s. They became very wealthy when Kodak bought that technology. They went on to develop the Stanley steamer motor car. But Chansonetta had learned photography with her brothers, and although they were willing to support her, she felt like she needed something to do. And so she chose photography and documented a vanishing way of life in rural Maine, taking pictures of people who had labored at the soil all their lives, and how the work ethic permeated from the oldest members of the community to the youngest, like this little girl feeding chickens from about 1901. She only had one photograph published during her lifetime, but she left the state of Maine a treasure trove of images. And later, in the 1920s, she had a lot of them printed onto glass plates, and her daughter hand-colored them so that she could give lantern slide presentations, the precursor to what I am doing right now, talking about her work and about her community in Maine. There were also women making photographs out west. Evelyn Cameron was not a native Westerner. She was born in luxury in 1868 on an estate outside of London. Her father was an East India merchant. They had 15 servants, but at the age of 21, she shocked her parents by marrying a poor Scotsman, 15 years older than she was, who shared her love of hunting and the outdoors. They decided to honeymoon as far away from the outraged parents as possible, so they went to the Badlands of Montana. And they fell in love with the landscape and took up horse ranching in Montana. Unfortunately, her husband was a terrible businessman. Imagine trying to raise polo ponies in Montana. So in 1894, having gone from that life of cooks and butlers to branding cattle and breaking horses, and doing the lion's share of work in her marriage, she realized she needed more income. They had taken in a boarder with a camera, and she exchanged rent for him teaching her to use the camera. And she became the photographer for their area of Montana, photographing her neighbors, but especially the women. She loved the Buckley sisters, Mabel, May, and Myrtle, here roping horses in 1909. Or other neighbors chopping down logs for the ranch. When there was any significant event going on, Evelyn Cameron was there with her camera. As was Elizabeth Roberts in North Dakota. She was born in 1874 and had 4 sisters, and her father was a rancher who, when she was 15, went to Wyoming to buy more cattle and was murdered for his gold. So that left a mother and 5 girls making their way on the prairie. They continued ranching, and Elizabeth worked for more than 30 years as North Dakota's first female game warden. And she took magnificent photographs. This Mrs. Elmer Pope from about 1905 has been called a quintessential image of life on the American frontier. So she also had a panoramic camera with a swing lens. The camera is still owned by the State Historical Society of North Dakota, so that she could make these panoramic images. And I chose this one because it's a sort of self-portrait. Because we can see, in addition to the hauling logs, the plowing, everything that she captured with this wide lens, here we see her shadow. right there, that pyramidal shape. Am I getting it? Right there. Her head, her arms holding the camera, and her long skirt on the prairie. Other women photographed more domestic spheres. And as one early professional photographer, Nancy Ford Cones, put it, quote, "It is a dead sure thing that if you cannot make pictures in or around the home, it is positively hopeless to go abroad to find them," end quote. Meaning not that women had to stay at home, but that if you couldn't make a good picture out of what you saw every day, you weren't going to make a good picture of the Grand Canal either. You had to train your eye by using it on what was around you. So for some women, that was domestic life. And again, this kind of subject, little girls or the embroidery frame, is very similar to what a painter like Mary Cassatt was making. So instead of purchasing an etching or engraving or a new photographic reproduction of an Impressionist painting, you could hang this on your walls instead. Photographing what you knew for some women meant photographing the great outdoors. And so Myra Albert Wiggins is here in 1891 trekking out into the Oregon mountains to capture Mount Jefferson from Grizzly Tarn. And then a few years later, a decade or so, she would use that deep knowledge of the landscape and combine it with her Dutch genre impulses to create this image, The Edge of the Cliff from 1903 or 1902, which Stieglitz published in his influential journal Camera Work, and which won a $100 prize. Eventually, Wiggins and her family moved to the state of Washington, where she did less photography and re-devoted herself to painting. She was one of those original 6 Washington women who founded the Women Painters of Washington. Sarah Ladd was also an Oregon member of the Photo Secession, who we know almost nothing about, but she created images like this gateway of the Inland Empire of the mouth of the Columbia River. Now, we know that she worked with her friend Lily White, who was the other Oregon photo secessionist, but whereas Ladd likes to make images that look devoid of human presence, Lily White almost always includes some evidence of human collaboration with the landscape, the sailboat, the pilings in the background. So imagine being the White family and naming your child Lily. Both Ladd and White worked together on a houseboat on the Columbia River for a few years. So they set up a dark room on the houseboat, went out by day to capture their images, developed them together, and worked collaboratively. We don't know if they were more than friends, but this is another Lily White image, which if you look at it, it looks like, oh no, this one is just wilderness. But CRNRR was the Carolina and Northwest Railroad. So look carefully, and you will see that's a railroad grade. But there are tracks laid there. We can't really see them, but we can sort of see the grade along the wild rushing river. Evelyn Cameron in Montana was a spectacular landscape photographer and also interested in nature photography, particularly in birds. So she would climb thousands of feet to get images like this of a red-tailed hawk's nest placed precariously on a pinnacle of rock. She is on the next pinnacle up, with her heavy camera, her tripod, and her glass plates. This was strenuous work. Just the physical labor of getting into position for these, to make these shots was considered impossible for women. But Frances Benjamin Johnston also went to Yellowstone in the 1890s when it had just opened as a national park to make images there to help increase tourism. And Mary Schaefer camped throughout the Canadian Rockies. This is her on a Canadian Geologic Survey trip looking for Maligne Lake, finding it, obviously, and this, because of her efforts, it became part of a national park. But she had originally, she was an American who married a Canadian botanist. And so she originally started doing images like this because her husband was making a catalog of flora of the northern US and Canada. And she contributed drawings, but was one of the early pioneers of close-scale nature photography. Now, because botanical illustration can depict several different life stages of a plant in one image, it was felt that photography would never be an appropriate substitute, but Schaefer understood that it could be a very useful tool in scientific illustration, and she too produced these so these would have both been originally black and white images that are hand-tinted to create slide presentations so that she could present her work to audiences in and around her home. The Southwest was an area where photographer Matilda Cox Stevenson brought her camera to the Pueblo tribes. So she was trained as an ethnographer and an archaeologist, and was very influential in forming what today is the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Her husband was working for the precursor of that and assigned to the Southwest when he died. And she persuaded the government to hire her in his stead. She had the same training. So she was the first archaeologist hired by the United States government. And she was very interested in the plight of the Native Americans on their reservations and in the dignity of their culture and heritage. However, she was the traditional Victorian-era busybody who was certain she knew what was right. And so she bullied her way into this very sacred chamber where the giant society of the Sia Pueblo, the 5 men against the wall, were curing the feverish boy that we see in the foreground. Really, there is no way that she should have been in this room or capturing this image, but she did it anyway for science and for America. So she produced the an annual report on the Sia in the early 1890s. She produced another annual report. These were book-length publications on the Zuni Indians in 1905, including photographs of these pictographs that had apparently never been seen by Western eyes previously. And the photograph at top is sort of the self-congratulatory one of, look at the arduous route that we had to take in order to get to making this image. Nearly all of the photographers, or a good proportion of them that we're looking at today, at some point turned their lenses to the Native American population. This was the era in which they were believed to be a vanishing race. So Myra Albert Wiggins, for a period, was making images of coastal Indian women at their work, like this Unloading the Catch from 1898. And Gertrude Käsebier had the opportunity when Wild Bill Hickok came to New York with his troupe of performing cowboys and Indians to photograph some of them in her studio. And she created some of the most moving studio portraits of Native Americans that had been made until that time. For instance, she affords Samuel American Horse as much dignity as she gave to the most famous artist of her day, Auguste Rodin, who sat for her in the same year, and was a terrible sitter. He was shy and uncooperative, but Käsebier waited until he forgot she was there. And then she could capture these introspective images of the great sculptor. There were also women who pioneered the use of photography in journalism. One of them was Jessie Tarbox Beals, who at 18 was teaching in a one-room schoolhouse. And they had the students and teachers selling magazine subscriptions. And she sold enough that she won a free camera. And she learned that she could make more money using that camera to take portraits than she could teaching school. Funny how some things never change. So Beals began her career as a photographer and eventually married, taught her husband the craft, and opened a studio with him. And in 1902, the Buffalo Courier invited her to head up their fledgling department of photography. So she became one of the first news photographers, one of the first photojournalists in America, and made images of fires and floods and courtroom dramas. And she went, out of Buffalo to capture newsworthy things elsewhere. So in 1904, she's at the St. Louis World's Fair. And that's her big camera with its glass plates. And she is balancing precariously up there to make her image. That same year was the St. Louis Olympics. And she captured, in this image, the pole vaulting. And just these 1904 Olympics photographs are so fascinating when we've just been through an Olympics. The level of professionalism was so low in 1904 compared to what it is now. And I don't know what this person is going to land on, but he won the event. And you can see that it's cropped. We don't have a lot of her news photographs because they were just sort of, devoured by the process of getting them reproduced. But this one is cropped, or the lines are there suggesting how she would crop it for a newspaper feature. There was also the World's Fair was the Louisiana Purchase exhibition in 1904 in St. Louis. And part of that exhibition, part of that World's Fair involved the highly racist practice of creating model villages of various so-called primitive peoples from around the world. So there were Native Americans. They built a sort of pueblo, but she has a photograph of someone with a full feather headdress standing in front of that pueblo. So they were mixing and matching their Indian cultures. This is a chief of the Igorot tribe in the Philippines. There were Japanese women in their kimono. There were people from all over, but they gave the Igorot chiefs typewriters, and they learned to type. And so this is the image that she captures of this, so-called primitive person with the most up-to-date modern technology in his otherwise uncovered lap, apparently. So eventually she moved to New York City and began to photograph the city itself. Lots of images in Greenwich Village and many images of the slums, of the conditions that immigrants were living in these years, although she was not such a progressive muckraker as people like Louis Hines. Nevertheless, these images do evoke our sympathy as we look at the filthy, bare feet of these children playing in the streets. Another photographer who was interested in social conditions was Frances Benjamin Johnston, of the tintypes in that early slide. She photographed in 1895 the workers at the Lynn Shoe Factory, who were primarily women, and the conditions under which they labored. Now, Johnston is someone who published extensively about photography. She believed that the camera could be an important tool to help women improve themselves, to help them create a career as photographers. And she photographed herself in 1896 as the new woman. So she's transgressively smoking and drinking a tankard of beer, and her legs are visible from the knee downward. It's quite an image, but it is less provocative perhaps than one that she made a few years earlier of herself in masculine garb with a bicycle. So Johnston, we know, was a lesbian. She had a lifelong partner who was also active in her photography studio. And she was one of the few photographers who had shown a real interest in the plight of the African American at the turn of the 20th century. So in 1895, she made this image of workers doing laundry at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. She'd been hired to make photographs of the engravers and the people running things through printing presses and the like, but she goes downstairs and photographs everyone. And that made her an obvious choice for Hampton and Tuskegee technical institutes who wanted someone to document the work that they were doing with young black students, mostly children of freed slaves, and also with Native Americans. So in this deep South, in 1899, she went to Hampton and took pictures like this one of the carpentry class. It's obviously a studiously posed image that is intended to give the most informative view of these young men plying their trade, but it went along with her philosophy of self-improvement, of how photography gave her a better life, just as the trades will give these students the promise of a brighter future. And this sounds like a mundane assignment, right? Go to make photographs at a school, but she was actually shot at one point during this assignment because she was traveling after dark with two black men. Never mind that they happened to be Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. Someone objected to them being with a white woman. So people like Johnston and Beals sometimes put themselves in danger for the sake of their art or for a more dramatic image. So 3 years later, she made a similar suite of photographs at the Tuskegee Institute, this one of women learning dressmaking. This was before these institutes re-evaluated their mission and began to focus more on higher education. And she would supply newsworthy images when she happened to make them. For instance, this one, which was the last photograph ever taken of President McKinley, just minutes before he was shot by an assassin. On Staten Island, Alice Austen grew up in privilege. She was a socialite who got her first camera as a gift at the age of 10. And she documented the life of wealthy Staten Island with its beautiful estates, the coaches, the footmen, and the parties. Socials, bicycling, horseback riding, and so forth. And this is quite a risque image. Trudy and I masked, short skirts. So she would have taken, probably half an hour to set up this image, get the camera angle just right. They would have had to stand still in indoor conditions for at least 15 or 30 seconds to make such a clear image. Sometimes her friends got impatient, but they were so tight, her group of friends, that the local men called them the Darned Club. Now, had she only photographed the life on Staten Island, she would have produced a really impressive body of work. But in the mid-1890s, she began to travel into Manhattan and make images of the street life that she saw there. Immigrants like these Hester Street egg sellers, rag pickers, day laborers, a shoelace seller standing by a fence. And she captures so much information in these images. We can read the side of the crate here. We get this wonderful effect here of the hats of the women in the background. Now that's a hat, that sort of butterfly form. That's another hat. The horses, the smile, the wit and warmth that Austen places into her images, and she too had a lifelong partner. And when the Alice Austen home was originally opened as a monument on Staten Island, the role of Gertrude Tate in her life was whitewashed out, and the local lesbians held protests until she was fully incorporated into the narrative. Some of these women made images of themselves, and I think it's quite fitting that Chansonetta Stanley Emmons, of herself, by herself, places the camera in focus and her face in less focus. It suggests the way that we often know so little about these women photographers, even if they were able to capture with their cameras things that were so delicate and gossamer they could hardly even be painted, like this spider web in the perfect light. Gertrude Käsebier did not like to make portraits of herself, but preferred to use her daughter and namesake, Gertrude Käsebier O'Malley, as a kind of surrogate for her. Here, Gertrude Käsebier O'Malley is playing billiards, a traditionally masculine pursuit, against a male opponent who stands there in the background. The younger Gertrude is lining up a shot, something that involves talent, a good eye, good instincts, and a genius for alignment, for getting things lined up just perfectly. The metaphor for photography is obvious. That perfect shot could be a ball in the corner pocket or a stunning photograph. By the end of the 19th century, Eastman Kodak realized that women were a huge market for their new lightweight cameras. So it was an ordeal to be a professional woman photographer, but Kodak realized the market for amateurs. And so they invented the Kodak girl. These are the Kodak girls at the World's Fair. And the Kodak girl urged to take a Kodak with you wherever you go. And to their credit, they hired artists like Myra Albert Wiggins to create their ad campaigns. So it is a woman making this image of two women staring at a developed roll of film with the liquid and the reel on the table. They are making photography look easy, manageable for women, social, not messy at all, but something that you can do in your home with your friends. And this is the new celluloid negative, not that glass plate negative that made those cameras so heavy. This is a very appealing image, but Kodak is trying to say, our cameras are so simple, even a child can use them. And again, we have Wiggins making this Dutch genre photo of the boy with the brownie photographing his dog. But Kodak's commercialism notwithstanding, there were women photographers already active at the turn of the century. And it wasn't always a neat or unstrenuous pursuit for them. It might involve muddy corrals, or trekking arduously into the mountains or desert, or arguing with one's spouse about the time spent laboring over one's art. But these women were making a significant impact on the world of photography and on the way that we would come to view our own world. Thank you. Are there questions or images you'd like a second look at? Yes,
Here,
I see a question.
You want to talk louder? You want to
Oh, this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
And when I was looking at the photos, especially in the beginning, it felt like even though you say that they're trying to distinguish themselves from painting, the photos really felt so painterly, artistic, designed, gorgeous. What was the relationship of these photographers with the art world, and specifically the art institutes, you know, the academies and fine arts centers and stuff? Did they have an art background, or were they excluded from that world?
So that's an excellent question. So what was the relationship of these painters or photographers to the art world? Do they have an art background? Were they excluded from that? Often they have a painting background, but not exclusively. Some of them just took up the camera. But Alfred Stieglitz, who was the originator, the founder of the photo secession group that so many of these early photographers belonged to, Stieglitz, who published photos by the Allens, by Gertrude Käsebier. In fact, I think the second issue of Camera Work was devoted to the work of Gertrude Käsebier. But in Camera Work, he was also beginning to introduce Picasso and Braque and contemporary European art to Americans. And he had a gallery in New York City where he did do exhibitions of photography, but also of contemporary painting and sculpture. So to receive Camera Work or the journals that that Stieglitz was editing and putting out into the world meant being, having your finger on the pulse not only of the world of photography, but of that of contemporary art as well. And yes, these early images, and I just want to flip forward to, that's one, or Emma Coleman, or that was the one I wanted to stop at. They have a very impressionist look to them. They are deliberately soft focus to look less mechanical, to look more self-consciously artistic, and it would be the reigning style in American photography sort of until Ansel Adams and Edward Weston and Imogen Cunningham in the late 20s, early 30s begin a sharper-edged style of photography as fine art photography. But they're really trying to distance themselves from works like this, which they didn't see as fine art. This, they thought, was, being a daguerreotypist was just having the camera and having the backdrops and having people sit still for as long as they could, but it wasn't creative in the eyes of the photo secession. And so they were trying to make images that look more like, that look painterly. And yes, women were often excluded from showing their work, from art schools, from exhibiting societies, as Lynn Ann mentioned, that the women of the Women Painters of Washington weren't getting their work shown. They had to found their own group. Okay. Yes. Oh, Sally again.
Another question. How much would the women photographers 50 years later, 40 years later, carry forward the legacy? Like someone like Dorothea Lange, who was posing her pictures, would she have studied any of these women? Would she have taken anything forward from the women who came before her?
So someone like Dorothea Lange or Imogen Cunningham, they would have grown up reading camera work. They would have grown up reading, and in fact, it was Imogen Cunningham's greatest goal to have a photograph published in camera work. So they would have known not all of these, like someone like Frances Benjamin Johnston wasn't of interest to Stieglitz. He thought that her work was too pedestrian. But they would have known Käsebier. They would have known Schutze. They would have known Anne Brigman. They would have known some of these artists that appeared in the pages of Stieglitz's journal. So they would have sort of cut their teeth with these pictorialist, misty, symbolically charged images. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to close it up
Okay.
then. Thank you
Well,
so
thank
much.
you.
Thank you.